Hello everybody, this is Dr Lillian Cespedes Gonzalez coming back with another mini lecture. And today you're gonna have to forgive me. I know that in my capacity of historian, I always do my best to follow the principles that we are all taught in our degrees at university. Historians are unbiased. We must never be swayed by the general trials and tribulations of life. If only life was so simple, and if only history was so simple. But it is true that the topic that I bring for you guys today is perhaps a bit more poignant and a bit more hitting home than usual. You know me, I like addressing the problems of the modern world from a perspective of the past, distant or not so distant, so that we are educated, so that we all have the same knowledge and, we can make whatever kind of decisions about life, make our own conclusions about the universe, about the world, without necessarily pointing fingers, right? I don't like that thing of pointing fingers. We have a saying in Spanish that says that every time you point a finger, you have another 3, if not 4, I guess depending how you're pointing, that point back at you. I guess it's something to do with Catholic guilt and minding what you say, which is pretty fair most of the time. But you see, in times like the ones we're living in, sometimes you do have to be biased. You do have to care about things like genocide, about things like rights being stripped from people, about the constant state of war, about equality, about all those things, which as historians, by the way, is our duty to protect. They will tell you that that's not what a historian's job is, that we are just keepers of the lore and the past. What is the point of keeping the lore and the past if it's not to protect the present and to protect the things that matter and that makes us human and that makes societies and civilizations be communities and places for people to supposedly live in harmony and be safe. So, as I woke up today reading a variety of English newspapers, because as a dutiful historian and overall human being that I am, my feed is balanced. I read the Telegraph in the same way that I read the Guardian, that I read the Independent, that I did read the Daily Echo, the Hampshire Chronicle, the BBC, NBC News, ABC, Sky News, Fox, CNN. I don't care who funds them or what the purpose is. I read them all. Because, well, the media, has this tendency of blurring the lines and sometimes not telling the whole story. But whatever the case, I do wake up today to see a barrage of media out there in this country speaking about how a certain political party, whose name may start with R and may finish in form, is essentially fear-mongering and campaigning to remove things like indefinite leave to remain, which is a status that allows people to be legally in the UK without being British citizens for an indefinite amount of time. Legal migration actually approved by, I was going to say Her Majesty's government. Actually, it's no longer Her Majesty's, His Majesty's. My apologies. And I think, as I say this, you all will realize why that kind of is important to me and why today the bias is personal in that regards. So, because it is personal, I feel it is my duty as per usual to share this story today with you guys. So we're going to go to the English Middle Ages, which is a period I don't often talk about because it's not really my jam. I find the English Middle Ages often far too depressing. War after war, misery after misery, cousin stabbing brother 24/7. And yet, as per usual, many of the problems that we face in modern day societies were not born yesterday. They actually come from the distant past. And it is when we look at the distant past and the things that were happening 1,000, 2,000, however many thousand years ago, even 100 years ago, even decades ago, where we start understanding the issues of our communities. And that is why today I'm taking you to the 13th century with me, to the time of Edward I. And why am I doing this? Because Edward I is a king who, over the last few hundred years in historiography, which you know is the science that studies history, so to speak, he's been kind of turned from a strong ruler to a national king, then some kind of tyrant and despot, like many others, then kind of washed again as, oh no, he was a very competent man, sort of thing. He's a king that has left a very strong legacy in the overall history of England and then the United Kingdom. And since this ties in with the things I've been reading this morning, I've seen some other types of articles, in this case, social media articles, suggesting that kids in this country should learn British history. Which, to be fair, to an extent, I am in agreement with. Many of you who follow me for a long time have heard me complain before of how outrageous it is to me that most kids go through the English educational system literally just knowing about the Tudors, the Empire, the Second World War, but not necessarily Britain's role in the Second World War, but mostly the Nazis. Maybe, just maybe, something to do with the Industrial Revolution. And if you are lucky, 1066. Apparently and allegedly one of the greatest moments in the history of this country, which has nothing to do with England. In fact, 1066 glorifies the very same thing that these people from these political parties seem to be so upset about. The fact that some people came with boats and actually took over the country. Like, by the way, has happened for hundreds of years in the shores of England specifically, but Britain overall. So this kind of made me think, how ironic. I wonder what would happen if we actually taught the kids in this country where their kings are from. You know, our monarchic society, which is mostly German, Bavarian, kings and queens who actually came from France, kings and queens who may have been from parts of the country that are now forgotten about, kings and queens who are not Londoners, kings and queens who were so detached from the day-to-day, kings and queens that were from Denmark, Norway, farther away, kings and queens constantly married to foreigners for the sake of security. Kings and queens that are glorified to be icons of this country as if they did something good for their country when in reality their people were suffering. So you know what? Yeah, maybe we should teach our kids in this country about their kings and queens. And that's why I'm here to tell you about Edward I. Because as much as Britain sometimes gives me a headache, it is my home and I have a duty to defend the history of my home. I love this country as much as I don't necessarily love the shape that this country is in. So today we're going to talk about how the realm of Edward I very much pushed some of the ideas that still prevail in English nationalism. And yes, to the rest of the United Kingdom, my beef is not with you, it's specifically with good old England. So buckle in. So first things first, let's get out of the way. Who's, Edward I? What did he do? Where did he come from? All that jazz. Well, you see, Edward I was the son of Henry III. He's going to be King of England from 1272 to 1307. And he, to be fair, is a man that kept really busy. He actually did a lot, like I said, for this country. He's often very well regarded for his crusading campaigns. He did go to war with pretty much everyone under the sun. And he was, through and through, a military king. Many of the great castles that we actually have, not just in England, but Wales, and even up north in Scotland, are actually a result of the constant development during the time of Edward I. But he's not a king that, had a lovely walk around the park and sort of, call it a day. He suffered different issues, mostly rebellions, because remember, his father Henry III had to deal with the consequences of the Barons' rebellions of his father, King John, and the development of the famous Magna Carta, which sets the basis for the first constitutions of the world and many of the constitutions and political bases upon which the English law system, still prevails. So, Edward is going to be a man of government, a man of policy, but also a man of war. In the midst of all of this, I'm sure you realize there is a lot of scope for, let's say, twisting the tale. And it is precisely because of the way that Edward approaches the majority of all of these issues, particularly the issue of war, where the sensation of English nationalism really comes through and shines. You see, we tend to forget that when we talk about British history and when we talk about teaching history of our country to our kids, the vast majority of people in the system are not interested in teaching British history, because teaching British history involves teaching the history of Wales, teaching the history of Scotland, and teaching the history of Ireland. And I mean Ireland through and through up until, certain amount of time was, although not always attached to the UK, always lingering around the UK, and it's important for context. Now, sadly, most people in this country would struggle to say a simple word in Wales, let alone a word in Scots or Scottish Gaelic or Irish itself. The majority of the history that is taught in Britain is an English-centric narrative. And that comes not just from the time of Edward I, but the general idea that actually starts arising during the time of the Middle Ages of England as a hegemon supreme power. Now, realistically, up until the High Middle Ages, England could barely really call itself a hegemon of anything. England was fragmented by different kingdoms that ruled themselves, that were constantly quarreling amongst themselves. I'm talking about the Heptarchy in the Anglo-Saxons. I'm talking about when the Norse arrived and half of the country was not even English. It was actually, Norwegian and Danish. I'm talking about when the Normans arrive and they take over, and therefore England isn't really English anymore. It's, essentially Norwegian French and all that, yes. But it is at this moment in time, particularly during the realm of Edward I, where English national identity starts really being pushed forward. Because with the, characteristics of his rule and his own personality, Edward is really able to perhaps do something that many other kings before him don't, which is to some extent demonstrate a certain alignment within his own ranks, one united front, a clear, agenda that can actually truly be represented as English and not something else. So, let's talk about some of the legacies that this man leaves behind and the reason why this English identity really starts coming through. And well, one of those big parts of the story is the relationship with Scotland. Scotland has always been considered Edward I's Achilles heel. Edward actually died in 1307 while fighting Robert Bruce and the Scots. His unfinished campaign was labeled as an English failure, and it's because of this that it's often been called an unwinnable war. And in fact, if you ask most people in Scotland, Robert Bruce is a great leader because of his constant, repellent attitude towards Edward. But this is not as simple as it seems. Truth be told, the issue with Scotland sort of begins because of, these blips that happen in history. The situation kind of gets tricky in 1289 when Alexander III actually died. And Edward had actually arranged a marriage between his son and one of Alexander's children, Margaret. But, Margaret will also die, and this kind of becomes a mute problem. So there is an issue over Scottish succession, essentially. And as overlord of Scotland, by the Treaty of Brigham in 1290, Edward was in charge of solving the dispute between the candidates that were available for this position. And yes, I say as Overlord of Scotland, because as the Treaty of Brigham sort of comes through, that is the role that Edward has at this moment in time. He's not just King of England, he has other political functions to fulfill. So in an attempt to resolve this dispute, he essentially tries to tilt the situation for his advantage and really pushes forward a candidate known as John Balliol. But John Balliol was essentially not about to accept being Edward's puppet, and here is where the conflict of interests ended in a very terrible alliance between Scotland and France in 1295, and essentially Edward pretty much ready, eager to wage war against Scotland. He will actually defeat Balliol in Berwick in March 1296, and by August that same year, Scotland technically surrenders. By 1297, the Scottish rebelled with the famous William Wallace as their leader, and that was the reason for yet a new war in the Highlands. You probably are all aware of the very famous Battle of Stirling Bridge, which, by the way, was an absolute disaster for the English. And yet, despite all of that, Edward managed to turn the tables in July 1298 with his victory at Falkirk. Nonetheless, the king really needed a whole series of expeditions until the year 1300 to deal with the situation in Scotland, particularly in the southwest. And the issue kind of seemed resolved, kind of not. Problem is, as much as Edward had some form of control, what Edward was trying to impose in Scotland went against the very desires of the Scotsmen. And, Scottish people are quite rebellious and very happy to be their own people. So guess what? Once again, in the general development of all of this, there are going to be some issues. In 1305, Wallace was actually captured, which you would think would have, knocked the rebellion on its head. But a new fear essentially arose because as a result of this whole conundrum, February 1306 is going to push forward the figure of Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick. And with Robert Bruce, obviously, are going to come a bunch of other followers, which are going to be amongst the most powerful families in Scotland. So Edward again decides that these Scottish people are really giving him too much of a headache. They should be behaving better than all of this. And up he goes again. They fought in Meaden, where Bruce was actually defeated, but he did escape. Edward followed this victory with a constant prosecution of Bruce's relatives and supporters. And the so-called King of Scotland reappeared in 1307. That year, the battle between England and Scotland took place in Loudon Hill, and is supposed to be a victory for the Scottish. I say supposed because, it was literally by the edge of a sword in this case. Reality is that, Edward would probably have been able to defeat Bruce and reconquer Scotland, but he's literally gonna die shortly after that battle, and a bit difficult, carrying on warring when you're dead. So this is the problem with Scotland and the reason why Edward is waging war up there. The frontier between England and Scotland has been such a headache for the longest time. This isn't even a medieval issue. It's an issue that goes back to the ancient past. We're talking about frontiers that exist in this case because of geography. If any of you have had the pleasure of actually crossing that border, and crossing that border hopefully on land, you notice it immediately. You kind of start driving up towards the area, whether you're east or west, towards the area of the Lake District, in the area of Lancaster, or even if you're in Yorkshire and the Yorkshire Dales, and suddenly England starts feeling different than the rest of the country. England is pretty flat overall. Then the closer you get to these areas, we start seeing more elevation, and then boom, you cross over, and here you have the very different wilderness of Scotland. We don't realize the incredible impact that geography actually has, not just in the development of countries, but in our local and national identities. Frontiers and borders often happen because of geography. Well, this has always been one of those issues. England always wanted more. Scotland always wanted to keep its own. And this problem will go back and forth, as you guys know, until the, union, properly speaking, happens in the 18th century. Now, it's not just Scotland, though. There is a few more issues that are going to push forward and that are going to be often based in war, and that is going to create this idea of English nationalism and to some extent English supremacy. Another achievement of Edward that very much pushes English nationalism and supremacy is actually his campaign in Wales. You see, since the Norman conquest, much of Western Wales had actually been already taken over by English lords, who essentially ruled in the area as marcher lords, and that often brought with them English colonists. Now, of course, I'm calling them English colonists, but remember, in the Norman conquest, they were sort of Anglo-Norman, so whatever you want to call them is fine. However, the situation in Wales was really not pleasant, and there are going to be many disturbances. Wales has been prone to rebellion through the Middle Ages, through and through. There is going to be a particularly big situation in 1274, where essentially one of the leaders, and apologies, my Welsh is actually a lot worse than it used to be, but it's the famous Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, which is going to be a pain in the rear for Edward. This is going to lead to a rebellion. Well, Edward's great tactics and strategies made the end of the conflict possible in 1277 with the Treaty of Conway. However, there is a clause in the treaty that essentially is not necessarily going to sit nicely in the whole process. You see, Llywelyn's brother, David, was actually the one that had started the rebellion. Apparently, Llywelyn didn't want to get involved in a conflict with Edward again, but there seemed to be some peace proposals, and the circumstances made him join the revolt. However, he died in the Battle of the River Irfan, but the campaign didn't last much longer. Gets to Snowdonia, pretty much, and then, well, things get a bit tricky. David, however, didn't surrender. There were 2 more insurrections in Wales in 1287, and then there's going to be another one in 1294, and it's just essentially a big mess. So as a result, Edward decides that he really needs to push for a proper conquest of Wales, because they were just as problematic as his neighbors farther up north. So this is what's going to lead to a campaign that, although with some difficulties, will actually be quite successful. In fact, to be fair, Edward gets a little bit lucky. Things get a little bit tricky for the Welsh during the winter campaign of 1294. Essentially, by spring, it had completely ruined them over. By spring of 1295, pretty much by March, Welsh opposition was essentially non-existent, and that kind of gives Edward a chance to really push with his full army, which, by the way, was actually a pretty well-trained army and well-equipped. And a month after victory, Edward was already, pushing in for the full pacification of Wales. So, because Wales becomes I'm not going to say easy success, because it definitely wasn't as easy as some of the sources lead us to believe, but because it becomes a big success, the pacification of Wales is not just going to mean that Wales is now pacified in terms of it's not going to bother us anymore. At this moment in time, there is such little opposition to Edward in Wales that this is pretty much what allows Edward, and from this point on, any kind of English power, to impose their will entirely on the country of Wales. As much as we tend to say that there is some cooperation between Wales and England, frankly, the reality is that Wales from this point on becomes essentially a subsidiary, tributary, whatever you want to call it, state to England. Sure, it is sort of independent, but in reality, it's just an appendix to England with some privileges. It's not the same relationship that England and Scotland are going to have. And part of the reason for that is the fact that when Edward crushes the rebellion in Scotland, the Scots eventually keep on coming back up. The central leadership of the Scots has always been a lot stronger than in Wales. And that actually dates back to, again, the very ancient past. Tanistry, which was the original way in which the Welsh tribes organized themselves. It's a very tricky concept. It literally means that you can sort of challenge the power of the king. Even when the king is on the throne, you can say, yeah, I don't like you anymore. I'm going to come for you. If you get the support of other people and if you get a strong army and, other political details that I will not bore you with right now, you can. That kind of tribalism and slightly different attitude is really going to fundamentally put Wales in jeopardy pretty much from the get-go. It's a very similar system to what was actually being used in Ireland. With all of the different high kings and whatnot. It's one of the reasons, for example, why both the English and the Norse and almost anybody that has tried to go to Ireland has really struggled to actually get control of the land, because this is a system of rulership that is very much based in tribal, clannish arrangements. You depose one leader, another one crops under a rock. It's quite tricky. But when you are able to completely steamroll all of that or push it far enough into the backdrop that it's no longer a problem, and you have such a overseer like Edward, who is meticulous and who will literally pull down all of the opposition and ensure that it doesn't become a problem, then you kind of have, nailed the issue in the head. A lot of people who had suffered under this, let's say, lack of political stability that often happened to be in places like Wales and Ireland, sometimes actually welcomed the arrival of some of these other people if they were given, I guess, a sense of security. From the purely theoretical perspective, England did look at least a little bit more stable in terms of leadership than some of these other places. And that's the reason why, once he actually gets into Wales, that's it. The military presence that he's going to put in the country with all those castles, left, right, and center, the money he's going to spend into keeping this place the way it was, is going to be very, very impressive. And you need to remember as well, the geography of Wales, very different from many parts of England. Wales is a country that doesn't necessarily have the same diversity of resources and riches than England. So to some extent, having access to the much wider network of what English economy, politics, and social abilities to trade with the world, etc., could allow, it kind of seemed like, I'm not going to say acceptable, but livable, I guess, acceptance to their rule. In Scotland, however, rulership was different. And that's the reason why this is a very different type of back and forth. But you see, the list of English achievement doesn't end there, right? Because remember that at this moment in time, England still owned part of France, the region of Gascony specifically. And the region of Gascony was very important for England because the real income from Gascony was about £17,000 of the time, not just through the assets, but also through trade, which is an insane amount of money. However, the issue is that the area of Gascony was technically subservient to the King of France in that regards, and there's going to be a lot of incidents between the English and French fleets in the north of France. There's going to be bad management of the diplomatic relationships between the two of them that will eventually lead to war. Edward's strategies and alliances didn't work the way he expected them. They will actually have a full campaign in Flanders, which ends up in absolute failure for him. And it actually eventually required the intervention of the Pope because it kind of got really out of hand. And so eventually peace was established between both countries. in that regards. But all these wars which Edward got involved with, you see, were very expensive. And he developed some good ideas to finance his wars. In fact, we often say that he was the very first king of this country to enjoy direct taxes, which, another important element of sustainability and survival. He also was one of the first people to actually properly tax the clergy, following the French example. And despite all of that, he still needed more money. The conquest of Wales alone cost him the best part of £273,000 of the time, plus 750,000 more that he used to finance the conflicts during 1294 and 1298. And then in 1307, when fighting up north with Scotland, he spent the best part of 1.3 million. Now, I know maybe this sounds like small money to us because we're working in modern day pounds, right? But consider those numbers. These are still big numbers, even for our modern day economy. When we think about war, we don't necessarily think about how much war costs us. It costs. And the cost comes from, well, the public at this moment in time. It is a very expensive business being at war. Asserting your supremacy through war may be easy, but it's never cheap. Never, ever. So, as a result, Edward had access to bankers, of course. One of his bankers was Riccardi of Lucca, but he led him into bankruptcy. And in 1299, he had to change him for another banker called Francesco Baldi of Florence. Whichever the case, though, regardless of the people he was actually asking money from, he was in debt. So, English supremacy came at the cost of the treasury. Serious money problems. I mean, this wasn't the first time that England had problems with money. It wasn't the first time Edward had problems with money. Remember how I told you we often think about him as a crusader? Well, as a crusader, before becoming King of England, he had struggled with financing his crusade. In fact, if you think about it, many of the issues that actually happened to Edward is that the Crusades are nothing but problematic to him. When his army arrived in the French port to go east, the French had already departed, so essentially he's kind of left to make his own way over there, and it's not going to be a very pleasant journey. By the time he managed to arrive to Acre and fought against the Mamluks, although he had some support from the realm of Cyprus, reinforcements from England eventually arrived, and the Mongols, doing their number on the Mamluks too, he knew he just couldn't defeat the vast Egyptian army because the constant attempt to get his navy in one piece to the Holy Land on his own had been terribly unsuccessful. He ended up being injured. There had been an assassination attempt on his life. He almost died, and eventually he had to essentially say, okay, I'm done crusading. It was tricky. And more importantly, he runs out of money while doing all of this. Now, despite being the figure of a crusader and, a very important warrior king, we have records that actually suggest that during the last years of his lifetime, he became actually a very violent man. One of his most well-known movements into violence actually is 100% explained through the expulsion of the Jews in 1290, because we tend to forget that England was actually the very first country to expel a whole other culture, nation, civilization, ethnicity, whatever you want to call it, in Europe at that moment in time. It's not just, however, a racial or ethnical issue, though. The Jews had a lot of money, and Edward, like I told you, was broke. So, there are other acts of violence, though. He's going to actually execute Prince David, that we were talking about, a bunch of other Welsh lords, William Wallace, of course, in 1305. We also have the execution of the Earl of Athol, which was actually the first execution of an earl since 1076. We often talk about Henry VIII and how many rolls rolled during his rulership. He wasn't the only one, guys. And the brutality actually worst since the events of 1306, which is, of course, the Robert the Bruce Rebellion. The cruelty he used against his own supporters, his own family, was absolutely shocking. Whenever we read sources about him, about his character, towards the end of the period, is really nasty. For a man that otherwise comes across as being very pious, and that we know he, for example, loved his wife, Eleanor of Castile, deeply. They were so madly in love. Like, they are truly one of those love stories of the Middle Ages that, seem to be for real. He cried and mourned her to the point many people thought he might die when she actually passed away after pretty much 12 pregnancies. He created this beautiful procession with crosses all the way from the south of England to Lincoln when she eventually was buried. This is how we get the famous Charing Cross of London, by the way. It was one of the stops in this procession. It seems that something goes, wrong with his mind, and pushes him into a very different side of personality that seems to have affected him and led him to make certain decisions which didn't necessarily turn out well for him or for his people. But, there were, like I said, a lot of things that Edward did that were good for this country, for his people, and that didn't have to do with war, and that will once again push that idea of English nationalism. Because one of the perhaps greatest gifts of Edward I to this country is the proper foundation of the English Parliament and lawmaking. Edward is well known for being an active lawmaker. He was very thorough. He was very methodic in the way he applied justice. Modern historians actually attributed his greatness in this area to his ministers. Sure, I guess we can say, it was not necessarily him, but the people that work for him. But at the end of the day, when you're king, you need to make these decisions if you put the right people in power. And those people are actually leveraging a system and providing, usefulness for the overall country. Then your decisions were good, right? Nonetheless, the evidence showed that the new policies that were made and worked out when he was ruler of England were actually quite an effective government. Some examples of this very advanced law system are the Statute of Westminster in 1275, which actually talks about the liberties of the country and the people. The Statute of Gloucester in 1278, which made a point about liberties being exercised before the king's judgment. The Statute of Mortmain in 1279, which forbid the granting of property to the church unless the Lord licensed it. The second statute of Westminster in 1285, discussing the rights between tenants and landowners. And finally, the Quo Warranto and the Quia Imptores, which talk about franchises and tenures. A lot of these things are very important for the country that we know nowadays as England. Without the development of this legal system, without the development of the English Parliament, I don't think that the society that we now recognize as England could exist. One of the greatest freedoms that this country has actually enjoyed for hundreds of years is that regardless of who was in power, the Parliament was supposed to be a free agent that actually looked after the interests of the people. That's the reason why we have, House of Lords, House of Commons. Commons is for the people. It's supposed to represent our interests as a society. Sure, we can get into how balanced it is and all that jazz, whatever you want. But nonetheless, at least to some extent, this man understood that the people needed representation and the people needed to be able to talk. And it is because of this parliament that the modern day of democracy, these ideas that we have in our modern day society are able to operate. It became the blueprint for what many parliaments across the world will be. So, we see the two edges of this sword, right? Nationalism, English supremacy, whatever you want to call it. It can be good and it can be bad. It can be good because it's given the country and its people law, justice, the ability to protect civilians, to avoid corruption, to create a system of liberties, of freedoms that should be enjoyed. This is the problem with nationalism, right? Nationalism is a double-edged sword, and there is a difference between being nationalistic and patriotic and being, I guess, oppressive and radical. To an extent, any ism has a degree of radical intent in there. There's nothing wrong with taking pride in where we come from, who we are, our nation, our culture, our values, right? It's important that we appreciate our roots. And from that regards, I think we can see where the beauty of English nationalism is and roots with the reign of Edward I, a man that gave us a legal system that actually paved the way for modern democracy, that produced perhaps one of the, at least up until recently, most balanced legal systems in the world, a political system that, despite bipartidarism, which has been a plague in English politics for hundreds of years, was never taken to the extreme, right? One of the greatest beauties about this country for the majority of at least the 20th century was that regardless who really was in power, things were balanced. You know, there was this very acute belief by most people in Europe that generally thought that bipartidarism in Britain was essentially just a charade that British people did purely for the sake of, upholding democratic values, because it didn't really matter whether Labour or the Conservatives were in power, more or less, although sure, leaning towards one side or the other of the political spectrum, more or less, the country will be stable. Always pulling more towards one side or the other, but stable. And therefore, you didn't necessarily have to panic or be super scared or frustrated about what your future was as an ordinary working class, normal pedestrian run-of-the-mill citizen. Sure, some years would be tougher, some years would be lighter, but there was a balance in the force, if you like, because of the parliament and because of parliamentary representation and because of all the fail-safes that exist within the English legal system. Or should I say existed? Because unfortunately, the supremacy of this English legal system has been changing in recent years. And that is what is allowing people like the, I guess, headliners that I mentioned at the beginning of this story to push for these kind of changes in the legal framework that threaten many people, ordinary people. Ordinary people who, I am sure, at any other moment in time, would have been happy to tell you that this was one of the greatest countries on the earth. And that's the reason why they came here, to this country, for a better life. To enjoy and be proud and contribute, more importantly, to the England that had been so superior, so amazing since the time of Edward I, despite his aggressive expansionism, which, by the way, is the reason why many people came to this country in the first place, right? That's kind of what happens when you take over 20% of the world at the beginning of the 20th century, that people move here, partially because you make them move here. But you see, this is the problem with nationalism. This is the problem with rulership. This is the problem with power. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad. But ultimately, when power resides in the hands of people that have agendas that are self-serving, it becomes twisted. And that is when nationalism becomes dangerous. We see it in Edward himself. He is self-serving his own agendas. He is intervening in places where, frankly, he probably should have stayed out of. He is pursuing his own success, his own power, his own victories, regardless of how much in debt he goes into. That's not servicing the people, that's servicing your own self. Nobody in England benefited from the fact that, Edward won against Wales. Great. another community to feed, another community to provide support to, another community bleeding money into a country that already didn't have money because the king had spent it all either crusading or fighting someone else, not fixing the problems of his people. And yet, what a wonderful king he was. Look at all of these things he did. What a beautiful thing to be English. So, after exploring the life of this very, reevaluated, constantly under the lens of historical scrutiny, and very much a leading force of English nationalism since the Middle Ages, I think we can all draw our own conclusions, as per usual, about what drives nationalism. Not just in this country, by the way. I'm just using England as an example here. England is not the only country dealing with this problem in this day and age. We have many countries across the world engaging in this kind of behavior, in this kind of narratives. Most of them have a very similar story to what I've just explained. Most of them have their own figures, pushing their own agendas. Look at our session about despotism in Italy. But not every country is the country where I live, the country that I love, and the country that I've worked so hard to be part of and to try and be proud of. So, on that note, and without wanting to let feelings get in the way, because that would be very unbiased of me, I guess all I'm trying to say is, for goodness sake, just pay attention about what's happening next to you. And again, remember that being proud of who you are and where you're from is not the same than being better than someone else. It doesn't give you the right to determine who is more entitled or less entitled to be where to do what. There are systems, there are processes, there are all these things that a lot of people have been fighting for hundreds of years to determine that. And if you find yourself agreeing with these nationalisms, with English nationalism, with any of these ideas, ask yourself why. Don't just blindly follow it. Ask yourself why, and ask yourself where this feeling and this idea comes from. What has happened for this idea to take root in society and in politics? And more importantly, ask yourself who is pushing that idea forward and why. Because most of these people are not altruistic. They are not doing it to improve your life. They are doing it to push their own agendas. And the agendas of people like Edward I, of William Wallace and Robert Bruce and David and Maria Medici and who else are not the same than the agendas and the ideas of people like me and like you. They are supposed to serve us, not to impose their will over us. And there is a big difference between those two concepts. So, if you are indeed a patriot who feels that there are things that need to change in this country, and there are many things that need to change in this country, just like in the rest of the world, then hold on to the good values and good reasons for English nationalism, the systems, the laws, the ways that we can all be represented, the ways that we can all improve, not through the aggressive expansionism that eventually turns a very powerful king into a horror Halloween-like character that was mean and horrible to even his own children. And on that note, I hope this has served of some kind of help for people who needed to understand where some of these issues came from, for anybody that may be feeling uncertain in the days that are coming forward, and for anybody who, like me, loves this country but often in this day and age cannot recognize it. It is the fact that we love it and we don't recognize it that will actually allow us to hang on to it and hope that we can make it a better place. The fight is not over, it's just begun. And it's important to understand what we are fighting for. Take care of yourselves, everybody. Have a lovely day.